The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda.
Grief is the great human equalizer. Suffering is the great human equalizer. You always have to be conscious when you speak that you're not just speaking for yourself, because, you know, everyone's got their story, and I've got mine.
Then, later on The Agenda.
It's strange to come upon a phone in the middle of nowhere. For one moment, I thought, could this be an emergency situation? No, it was a phone to talk to the dead.
Over the years, David Frum has been a frequent visitor to this program. His expert knowledge of current affairs has always been welcomed on these airwaves. Well, David is with us again tonight, but this time on a very different subject. Miranda Frum, the 32-year-old daughter of David and his wife Danielle, died this past February, and it has given the Frums an expertise in grief they never wanted but must now reckon with. David joins us now from Washington, D.C., and David, as I welcome you to the program, I think probably the best way to start this conversation, since we have somebody making a cameo on your lap right now, is for you to tell us the story of when you are in your kitchen making coffee and Ringo is there and you have a conversation with your daughter. Take it away.
So this is Ringo, my daughter Miranda's spaniel. My wife Danielle and I bought Ringo for Danielle for Miranda as a gift in the spring of 2018, and they became boon companions. And Ringo was with Miranda when she was found after dying of the complications from a brain tumor. I wrote an article about the loss, and I began by talking about Ringo because he sort of summed up so much of Miranda's spirit. It was the summer of 2018. I was in the kitchen in Prince Edward County, Ontario, and Ringo walked up to the kitchen counter, lifted his leg, and urinated all over the oven door with his eyes straight at me the whole time. I'm looking at you. And afterwards, I said, it was so aggressive and provocative. And I said to Miranda afterwards, I don't think Ringo likes me very much. And Miranda said, oh, he loves you. He just doesn't respect you. And as you can see, many things have changed over the years, but that does not. And but he was very demanding of my attention, so much so that I told Miranda, I said to Miranda, well, I think at least he likes to spend time with me. And she said, don't flatter yourself. He thinks of you as his assistant. And I said, okay, I'll take that. And Miranda said, but he has many assistants. He's a Hollywood dog. He has many assistants. Mom is assistant number 1, and you are assistant number 2. And that became my family nickname ever since, assistant number 2.
You know, what I love about those stories is they show how absolutely whip-smart funny your daughter was. Oh, my goodness.
Oh my goodness, she was she's the brightest wit in every room, and she was so fast. She was also so brave, not fearless, because we all have fears. But she was diagnosed when she was 27 with this highly advanced and dangerous brain tumor, and she retained, and it was terrifying to her, of course, as it would be to anybody. And she retained, incredible wit all through that, and we quote her lines, and many of them are in the piece I wrote for The Atlantic. I'm conscious as I talk about her that I imagine everyone I'm talking to has losses of some kind or another. This is a world full of grief, and one of the things grief is the great human equalizer. Suffering is the great human equalizer. You always have to be conscious when you speak that you're not just speaking for yourself, because you know everyone's got their story, and I've got mine. But I think what I tried to do in the article I wrote about Miranda was to find how are we in this together, and how do we, those of us who have to straggle on afterwards, how do we carry each other along?
Well, let's do an excerpt from that piece, because it was an absolutely brilliant piece that you did for Atlantic. Sheldon, if you would, let's bring this graphic up, and for those listening on podcast, I'll read along. Here's David Frum in The Atlantic. For me, the thought of my own death has never been a distressing subject. We live, we love, we yield the stage to our children. I hoped that when the time arrived, I would have the chance for farewells. If that wish were granted, I could, with total content, ride the train to my final destination. It never occurred to me that one of my children might board the train first, pulling away as her parents wept on the platform. Okay, this is, I don't mind telling you, this is probably going to be the hardest interview that I've ever done, just because you and I have known each other for a long time, and in order to sort of deal with the subject of grief, I'm going to have to ask you a bunch of questions I don't think I normally would, away from the cameras. So let's see how we do. How did you find out about Miranda's death?
It was about 20 to 11 on the morning of Friday, February 16th. I was preparing, as I so often am, for a podcast, in this case with Tim Miller of The Bulwark. We were to start at 11. And about 20 minutes before that, I received a text from my youngest daughter, who's studying a semester abroad, that one of Miranda's friends was trying urgently to get in touch with me. And so I called that friend back, and the friend shared the news that Miranda had been found, and the friend was very humane in the way she told the story. She said Miranda had someone came in to clean her apartment once a week. That the person had come in that morning, had found Miranda. She wasn't breathing. She called 911, and I said, has she been taken to the hospital? And the friend had to then say, no, Miranda's dead. She died in the night before. When the brain tumor that Miranda suffered from had done, although it was caught and removed, it was not a cancerous brain tumor. It was non-cancerous, but there's no such thing as a benign brain tumor. It was aggressive and advanced, and had done a lot of damage to the glands of her brain, leaving her with a permanently depleted endocrine system. And your hormones regulate your whole body. They thirst, sleep, response to infection. And so she was vulnerable, and she was a person who loved life. She was not going to live as an invalid. She tried to live as a healthy person, as a normal person. And the two facts of the depleted immune and endocrine system and her determination to live life to the full, they met at about 3 a.m. on February 16th of this year.
Do you have any idea whether she knew she was dying?
I do know that in the 6 or 8 weeks before, she made a special point of visiting in person everyone in the world she loved in many, many different cities. And this, she was always a footloose kind of person, but she went to New York, she went to Los Angeles, she went to Toronto, I don't think she was consciously saying goodbye, but it was like she was doing a last tour of this world she had loved so well, and she loved her. The thing about, among the many things one might say about Miranda, she had this gift for making profoundly intimate friends extraordinarily quickly. And one of the stories about Ringo, she was walking Ringo in a park in Lower Manhattan, and there was an older man who with a sketchbook, and he made a sketch of Ringo and presented it to her. And he was slightly above the age where this was a flirtatious move, although who knows. So she got into conversation with him. It turns out he was an extremely well-known artist who's exhibited at all the major New York museums, has works in the permanent collection. He was a veteran of the Israeli army in the war of 1973, and they became intimate friends. And she would visit with him, and all because he had sketched Ringo. So she had people like that all over the world, and I think she bade them farewell.
Why did you and Danielle name her Miranda?
So Danielle and I met in the summer of 1987, and I'm a pretty cerebral person, as you know, but in this one domain, I am not cerebral at all. We were, I think the topic of discussion on our fourth date was what would we call our children, and we both love the name Miranda because it means literally something to wonder at, something to be amazed by. And I think the first use of it is in Shakespeare's play The Tempest, and that suited her too because she was a tempest.
I gather you have inherited Ringo now. This may be a bit of a strange question, but can you tell whether Ringo went through a grieving period not being with her?
about he often had stayed with us when she would travel, so he was very used to us. There are other dogs here. We've got a kind of dog pack, so he was quite familiar, and especially in our place in Ontario, which he loves and chases the birds. So he's used to being with us for a week or 10 days, even 2 weeks. About 2.5 weeks after Miranda died, at about 4 a.m, he was lying at the foot of the bed and just let out suddenly in his sleep this howl. Unlike anything we'd ever heard from him before, of distress and sorrow. And it was as if he had dreamed of her. Perhaps do dogs dreams? I think so. We see their little feet running. He lay with her. He lay with her between the time she died and the time her body was found about 6 hours later. When her body was moved, he was with her at her funeral in Toronto. He lay motionless beside the coffin. And when we laid her to rest in the earth, he stood by the edge of the pit and watched her in, and then ever after he said, been bonded to my wife. But yes, I think he knows. I think dogs grieve.
You once asked Miranda, why does he bark so much? What did she respond? He's a bird hunter. I mean, he's just a maniac, and he just barks and barks at them. And I said to her, well, does he have to do that? Can we discipline him in some way? And she said, well, why do you tweet? I mean, it's the same impulse, like exactly. It's just like syllables into the vapor. Like, what's the blinking point? Who cares? And it's probably as noisy and disruptive in his own way as Ringo's barking. So you got me. No, she always got the last word. She had a last word to Ringo. Ringo, stands 10 inches high at the shoulder, and he's very physically powerful because she lived for a while on the top floor of a 6-story walk-up in Soho, and each stair was almost as tall as Ringo, so he would do a full body press up every step all the way up the 6 stories, and then jump down. It was like an Olympic athlete, so he's incredibly buff, but he is small, and when he would jump onto furniture or try to, and he would miss, Miranda would look around the room and then whisper to him, "Don't worry, no one saw." I presume everybody is thinking right now the dog is obviously named after one of the Beatles. Is that in fact the case?
That is not the case. That is not the case. And there's a little. I'm going to bring you a little Canadian content here. So, Lorne Greene, remember him? He was the Canadian CBC announcer who told the story of Canadian troops during the Second World War on CBC Radio in the 1940s, and then went to Hollywood and had a big career there. But became probably best known role was he played the head of the family in the TV Western series Bonanza. So in the early 1960s, Lorne Greene wanted to diversify, and he wanted to make a record, but he couldn't sing at all. So he found this. I don't know whether he found it or it was written for him. But he wrote this ballad of a Western desperado named Johnny Ringo, who in the 1880s was a bank robber. A lot of people was an ex-Confederate soldier, and he made this ballad of Johnny Ringo and who terrorized the West. And he recorded that about 6 months before the Beatles became world famous, and the record was released about 6 weeks before the Beatles became world famous. And then, to Lorne Greene's dismay, the Beatles made their American tour, and everyone assumed that his song on his album, which was supposed to make his singing career or his spoken word career, was about Ringo Starr. But of course, it wasn't. It was about this figure from American history. And Miranda named Ringo after the outlaw Johnny Ringo because she knew from the first moment she met him, this guy's an outlaw.
That sounds like a very Miranda thing to do. Not after the famous Beatle, but after something much more obscure.
Yes,
I think so. David, how does a father who presumably has never prepared himself for this moment, because you, of course, hope like hell it'll never happen, how do you even begin to figure out how to put one foot in front of another after this happens?
Yeah. Well, as you saw in that sample you read about, I'm not phobic about my own death. I have elaborate plans in place. There are documents in file, and all my. By the way, one of the things I recommend anyone listening, if you take one thing away from this, make sure you have a list of your passwords for all your computer programs, and make sure your loved ones know where they are. So I have that in a folder. Here are my passwords. Here's when the gas bill is due. Here's my will in the folder. Here's the insurance policy. It's all. And my wife and I had begun planning where we would be buried someday together. And we had revolved many options, and we finally resolved there's a small Jewish cemetery near Prince Edward County, halfway between Trenton and Belleville, just east of the Canadian Forces Base. And we thought, that would be convenient to where our children would be, because they're going to stay in Prince Edward County. So we'd begun shopping for that, and then we had to suddenly, very fast, make all the decisions that we were non-phobically preparing for ourselves, and make them for a child. And that is, as I say, everyone's got losses. The thing about the loss of a child, I mean, there are many kind of griefs. I think Canadians have just witnessed the incredibly beautiful ceremony for former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and saw his loving family there. But there are things you psychically prepare for, even if you never talk about the husbands and wives psychically prepare. One of us will outlive the other. That just has to be the way. But children certainly prepare for their parents as much as they dread it. They're ready for it. You're not ready for the loss of a child. And there's something else. I read something just today by a writer who lost his beloved partner of many years, and how he's begun to see other people, and when he flirts with other women, that he thinks about what his partner would think, and he thinks about it with some warmth and amusement. Well, you can love your partner as much as that man did, and still 2 or 3 years later begin to see other women. There's no other child. There's no. You don't say, we'll have, that's it. And with this, and of course, the door is closed behind you, because this was going to be your future. For me, I think I'm a religious believer, but I'm not I don't have much confidence in any individual consciousness after death. So I don't think for me there's any hope. But my hope was always that my children would be happy. I provide for them and leave them memories of me, and they'd at first be sad, and then think, then laugh. That's the way of the world.
I imagine you have been inundated by those who want to do the right thing, say the right thing, be helpful, all of that. What have you learned, and what can you tell us on that list of, here's a good thing to say, here is something you should never say?
Look, the things you should never say are I won't insult the TVO audience by suggesting that there's anyone who would watch this program who would say something you shouldn't say. The big problem that the kind of sensitive and intelligent person who would watch you would have is people are sometimes afraid to say anything because they become so afraid of saying the wrong thing, they say nothing. So unless you are just a boorish, oafish person, anything you say is going to be better than nothing. And it really comforts. And some things, and just because of there's a random process that there are many people who comfort, there's a person who's consoled, and different people will respond to different things. So you may say the right thing, and it may be as beautiful as you say it. It might not be the thing that person needed to hear that. It's okay. It's like the total volume. It's the things that fill the air. If there's enough confetti in the air, you can catch some of it. And for us, the thing we keep quoting back and forth to each other, and I, by the way, I've used this story before, and the person heard it and said, you can use my name, so I will use the name. We got a note from someone I know a little bit who's a senior agent at WME, Robert Newman, and he lost his daughter, Leah Newman, at age 33. She died after giving birth to a child. He and his wife, Cindy, had 4 children, and this was the child who most wanted a child of her own, and then lost her life giving birth to the healthy child that lost her own life. And we have had some conversations with the Newman family, and Robert, being a Hollywood agent, said the thing in Agedese that I found. Danielle and I have quoted this 50 times. He said, if the angel of death were to appear to you as a parent and say, I can bring your child back, but you have to jump off this 10-story building, you do it without looking back. You do it with a smile on your face. He said, but that's not on the table. And that phrase, that's not on the table, has become, as we think, we have 2 other children. We have to live for them. We have a marriage. We have to keep that going. We have a lot of other dogs in this house, and they all need to be fed every damn day 2 times and walked. So you can't exit this earth. So you have to focus on what's on the table and what's not on the table. And for me, that was helpful. But I would say, if you're listening to this for any kind of inspiration, what to do, don't worry. Just do something. And maybe it'll be the right thing, maybe not, but you'll be one of 40 people, and I guarantee one of them will say the weird thing in the way that that's not on the table resonated with Danielle and me. That somebody will say it. Maybe it'll be you, but just don't be afraid, because you're not going to say the oafish thing. There are one or two people. I mean, have heard from so many people that just because of the law of big numbers, there were one or two oafs. But if it's less public, and instead of hearing from hundreds or thousands, you hear from dozens, there aren't going to be any oafs. There are not so many. Most people in the world reserve their oafish behavior for trolling on the internet, not for talking to grieving people.
Right on. You just referenced the fact that you have two other children, and who, I have to say, spoke absolutely magnificently at their sister's funeral. They were incredible. Yeah. I wonder if you can compare the kind of grief they are experiencing at losing a sibling versus what you are going through as a parent.
Well, I've heard now from a number of people who have been in this situation themselves that sibling loss is really an underappreciated phenomenon, because everyone gets that the parents of a lost child are going to be crushed. But the loss of the siblings is huge too. And I mean, our three children were particularly close. But even when not close, I mean, even if think about it, I mean, if you're married and you have a brother or sister, and the conversation goes on to weird things that happened in your family in 1969, your spouse is going to go to bed before your brother or sister does. And they're going to get weary of the whole subject. The only people who are interested in the tiny little civilization that was your childhood are your siblings. Not even your loving spouse can endure as much of it as your siblings can. And so when they are co-citizens of this tiny civilization that was your childhood, and the civilization that is just lost. Childhood is always lost, but you keep it alive inside you, but it's gone. And in our case, there was a big age gap between the two older children, 2 years apart, and the youngest B, who was 8 years younger than her brother and 10 years younger than her sister. When sisters are 10 years apart, I've observed that one of two things can happen. Either that's a tremendous maker of distance because their experiences are so different, or it's tremendous bonding relationship because the 10-year-old sister becomes a kind of backup mom, a cooler and more understanding mom than the actual mom. A mom you can tell some of your less creditable adventures to in a way that the two of you can be co-conspirators and covering them up from the actual mom who would be upset. And so Miranda and B had this intense relationship. Nat and Miranda had this intense relationship, and they are, but they're carrying on in her. They're going to keep her memory alive. I mean, odds are I've got only so many years of keeping her memory green, but those two children and their children in time will keep her memory green into the next century.
Every couple deals with this differently. I've talked to couples in the past who immediately go out and join a group of other parents who've been through this, and they find comfort in that. Others want to stay far away from that. Have you figured that out yet? Yeah,
I would say about the couple thing. I mean, let me just, if we're dealing with things that people might find useful. So the first thing I would say is, if you have the good fortune to have a real functioning marriage, it's really important to keep it going, because the marriage can easily be a casualty. Men and women grieve differently, and misunderstandings can grow in the space between the way men and women grieve. And husbands and wives, fathers and mothers, they grieve differently. And it's really important that you, from the beginning, say, we're doing this. We made this person as a partnership. We raised her as a partnership. We have to mourn her as a partnership. And you cannot allow any space to come in between you in that time, even though it's a time of pressure, and space can materialize. Space doesn't materialize. Cracks can materialize, and bad things can appear in the cracks. Some people find groups very helpful. It depends somewhat on the circumstances also of the loss. People have had very specific mental illness, suicides, victims of homicide. For us, I think Danielle and I have really made a decision that grief is not going to be our next career. We have things we need to do on this earth. We are going to do them, and we will grieve as a family, but we're not going to be, we talk to people who have helpful things to say, but we're not joining permanent groups. I want to stress they can be, for people with certain particular kinds of losses, they can be magnificently supportive and indispensable.
Mm-hmm. This next question may be the hardest one I'm going to ask here, so here goes. Fair warning. Even if our kids scrape a knee on the playground, we as parents always ask ourselves, was there anything we could have done to ensure that that scraped knee didn't happen? So how do you handle those moments where you are asking yourself right now, is there anything we could have done to prevent this?
Yeah. That's an important question. It's a painful question to answer, because in our case, the question, was there something that could have been done differently? The answer is yes. Miranda was on this array of artificial hormones to, again, regulate her sleep, regulate her thirst, regulate her immune system. And it was a moving target. You always had to be adjusting them and changing them, and you had to really keep on top of it. And again, and it had to dramatically circumscribe your own life, because you had to keep a very, travel was a lot of things you would think travel was dangerous. Exposure to other people was dangerous. Any irregularity and routine was dangerous. So theoretically, if we could have gotten a court order and sentenced her to live in some some desert climate forever, and wake up the same day and go to bed every day and have no stress and very little company and no travel. If you don't have an immune system, it's going to catch up with you sooner or later, but it didn't have to catch up with her that day. But when I say all of that, you realize the impossibility of it, because Miranda wanted to live, but if you had said the price of living to 80 is to live forever as an invalid, and if you want to live if you want to live in full, it's a risk. Miranda always took risks. She made her living as a fashion model. She was working in Israel during the 2014 Hamas war. She didn't leave. She continued to do photo shoots. She learned to become a foreign correspondent. So she was simultaneously posing for glamorous photographs and then typing, going to bomb scenes and interviewing people and writing up her recollections, which appeared in the Daily Beast. When she would travel in Europe with friends, and during that time and after, there's a lot of anti-Semitic intimidation, as people know, in the cities of Europe. And when she was at close quarters in the Paris subway, and she would begin speaking Hebrew loudly when people tried to intimidate her, to make it clear, I am not backing down. That was the person she was. And if the price of living a little longer was to not be the person she was, she wouldn't have made that agreement, much as we would have recommended it, and there isn't a court that would have given us the order that we needed to make her enforce it. And then we would have just spent our time in bitterness, with us being the scolds to tell her, the only way for you to live is not to live.
David, do you think it will be possible for you, your wife, your kids, your extended family, ever to be happy again?
Ever to be. So, it feels like an amputation. And then you turn on the TV, and there are people with amputated legs running faster than people with two legs. There are people with amputated arms climbing mountains that are so hazardous that you'd have questioned the mental health of someone who went up them with both arms. People function. There are people who function through grief and suffering and pain. That's our common lot as human beings. And I think I can imagine that you can live a life where you avoid it by space. Like if you just space everything out so perfectly, and you die you live happily and then die yourself before anyone you care about very much dies ahead of you. You can avoid it that way, or you can just be an obtuse, unfeeling, and sociopathic person, and then that's a great way to avoid grief. I don't think sociopaths ever feel grief for anybody, but it's our lot, and then you have to say so. You just have to have a more tragic kind of happiness. So my late mother, Barbara, many people watch the show will remember, she died at 54. I think Canadians remember that she died early, but they forget she was 54. Died in March of 1992, and and she didn't die suddenly. She was diagnosed with the disease that killed her when she was 37 and was told you have a very short time to live. And the doctors kept giving her extensions, but she had 2 years to live at age 37. Then she was given 2 more years at age 39 and so on until it caught up with her at age 54. But she always said that there are people who know and there are people who don't know. So every time you bite into a raspberry and feel that joy, it's a joy filled with tragedy, because to all of us, there are only so many raspberry seasons.
Last question, David. As luck would have it, I got together last week with somebody who lost a child at a very early age, much younger than Miranda. And when I asked her, when people ask you how many kids do you have, she always answers 2 living.
Yes.
She had 3, but she says 2 living. And if people want to follow up on what that means, they can. And if they'd rather not, they move on. Have you thought about how you will answer that question in the future?
I have thought. She anticipated me. That's exactly the way I would answer it. I think that's right. I mean, that's, by the way, that's a little bit more tactful. I would say I had 3, I have 2. But I like her answer better. It's because it's the same concept but expressed more tactfully. Because it gives the person the option of not asking. About a month after we lost Miranda, I was involved in some very routine service that I use a lot, and a person I see every 10 weeks and provides a service, and she asked me how I was. Do I tell her? She doesn't need that. Her life's difficult enough. She's got problems of her own. So I just said, it's fine. Thank you. Not everybody needs to have everything laid on them.
I get you. David, as I said to you in the email when we set this up, I really wanted to talk to you because I thought your experiences in dealing with grief could help a lot of other people. And I know for certain you've done that tonight. So thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, we're traveling to Acton in Guelph to look at an unusual tool for processing grief, a phone that doesn't actually call anyone.
One day I was walking along the pond path, and it goes into the forest, and it's just quite magical in there, and I was just wandering around, just kind of mesmerized by the trees. And then off to the right there's this booth, this little thing, and there's a phone, like the old school phone with the rotary.
It's strange to come upon a phone in the middle of nowhere. For one moment I thought, could this be an emergency situation? No, it was a phone to talk to the dead.
I have been working with people who are dying for my entire career. So I would say I've probably worked with thousands of people at the end of life as a music therapist. And so when I picked up the phone, I was like struck by, who would I want to hear from? Who would I want to interact with? Where are you? How has it been? You know, I was sort of flooded by a memory of a lot of different people.
It looks like the life that I shared with Mom and Dad for so many years.
My name is Catherine Manning, and I am a music therapist, and I live and work in Guelph, Ontario. So I work at Hospice Wellington, which is a beautiful hospice facility offering 10 beds and end-of-life support for folks with wonderful nursing and healthcare support.
I'm Linda Clark. I live here in Guelph. I'm Peter and Jerry Clark's daughter. I came upon Keith's wind phone in June of last year. And even though my parents died 6 years ago, grief is ongoing, and the wind phone was a really sweet and important part of that.
Well, I think what's really neat about the wind phone is that it's an access point for an expression of grief, or to externalize our grief. They provide an avenue to interact with our grief. I have a sense of them being like a side door to encounter feelings that we have around the losses that we have. In the wake of a death, people are in an altered state. Having opportunities for encounters with nature, beauty, aesthetics, the arts, and the wind phones, it's something of a symbolic intermediary, as something that you can interact with through another means. What's difficult sometimes with grief and bereavement or with losing somebody is that to look at it straight on is very difficult, especially when you're in that state of shock or a raw state afterwards. A wind phone in the woods is really an interesting invitation. First of all, being in the woods opens your senses. It allows you to enter into a bit of a different space, a liminal space, where all of the old rules don't apply, and it allows you to touch base with the deeper mystical side of life. When you lose somebody, there's an ephemeral quality to the loss. It's very helpful in the process of adjusting to that new reality to have tools or practices that allow you to interact with the shift.
So there's a feeling of walking away from regular world, regular life. There is that physical beauty of these trees that go higher and higher, and it's gorgeous. It's gorgeous. For my mom, not unusual for women of her time, the phone was her lifeline forever. So many of the memories I have of Mom are sitting at the table talking on the phone, picking up the phone. Who am I talking to today? My father was always, okay then, handing it over to somebody else. But it was that phone, and there was a feeling of familiarity, which is lovely, actually lovely.
My name's Keith Lamont. We're at Thistlestone Farm. I've been here for 45 years. For that time, it's been a sheep breeding operation and our home. And for the last 10 years also, we host guests who come and stay with us. So I installed the wind phone this past March. And I had read about a Canadian physician on the prairies. She sponsored one on a trail for the benefit of her patients. She thought they might embrace this opportunity to pick up a phone and talk to somebody. My wife and I in 1979 were working in jobs in the city, and we embraced the opportunity to come here and put this farm to use. In around 2005, my wife entered, at about 51 years of age, into the start of young onset dementia. And for about 10 years after that, she was able to continue to live here. And for the last 3 years of those 10, I had PSWs before Mary entered into long-term care center and died in 2022. So this wind phone was around the diagnosis time when life is full of turmoil. If I'd discovered something like that on my own, I would have just let loose to that. That's all past for me because there was a lot of ambiguous loss, times when you're losing another aspect of that person. This is a new endeavor for me, and I did some exploration when I discovered about wind phones. The original in Japan goes back a while, and I didn't realize there was so many wind phones. I understand there's one in Guelph, and there's one in Mississauga, and there's one here, and there's one in a small village. They're for the public just to pick up and use as they're walking by in a public space. I don't advertise the fact the wind phone's there. I want people just to discover it. So all the reward for me for this is now hearing people's response to discovering the wind phone.
When I came upon Keith's wind phone, I was astonished, would be the first word. I was astonished. The trees were what a friend of mine would call cathedral trees. It's a very quiet, secluded spot. So I was curious. I was shy. I looked around. I was reluctant, because I knew there's not going to be anybody on the other end. But when you lose somebody, you keep wishing that you'd hear their voice or you'd catch a glimpse of them. And there's always a little part of me that's listening for something like that. So I looked around and there was nobody there, and I thought, okay, I'll just try this. And I got up and I read the engraving, and it was lovely, and I picked it up. And of course, there's nothing, absolutely nothing, of course, on the other end. And I thought, oh, this is stupid. And I hung up and I walked away. And a couple of days passed. We were staying at Keith's farm. And I thought, go back to the wind phone and have an open mind. see if something happens. So I retraced my steps, again appreciating, and even now remembering it, appreciating the sounds, the top of the trees and the smells of the forest and all the rest of it. And I stood there in front of that phone and I picked it up and I spoke and I said something. Actually, I remember very well what I said. I said, "Hi, Mom and Dad. It's Linda. We're all fine. We're all fine. We sure miss you. We wonder if you're okay. Gee, I wish you could come back and tell us we had done a good thing. Love you, bye." And then I walked away. It stimulated memories that I hadn't thought about for a long time. So the wind phone really does work. It brings you back to places with the loved ones that you're thinking of. And for me, it was Mom and Dad. And all sorts of memories came back and all sorts of images, joyful, the difficult ones, all those ones came back. And you realize, that's what the wind phone is for. It's to connect us in that way. I knew that it wasn't going to, quote unquote, cure my grief. There's no cure for grief. Time changes it, but time doesn't take it away. My grief is as familiar to me as my hand is. The education around grieving is minimal. And I mean, we all experience it, and somehow when we experience it, it segregates us. Shouldn't you be over that by now? It makes me smile and occasionally giggle that, I was in the middle of the woods at our friend's farm and I was laughing because I was using the phone to talk to my parents and I knew they weren't there, but it was important to me. So it's really touching on something that we need. And maybe, I'm not a religious person. I don't go to church and all the rest of it. Perhaps that's what's lacking, is that ritual that goes around saying goodbye to people that we love.
Philosophy professor Kristen Andrews thinks a lot about how animals think. We talked to her about why understanding dolphin babysitters and whether rats have culture could enhance our multi-species world.
I love going to shopping malls and just watching people walk around the shopping malls and do their very strange things. It's just as interesting as going to the forest in Indonesia and watching the orangutans or watching the ants in my backyard. We are weird animals. I'm Kristen Andrews. I'm professor of philosophy at York University and York Research Chair in Animal Minds. Philosophy is an approach to questions that don't have answers using purely scientific methods. It's a project that I think most people actually engage in all the time. Sometimes what philosophers have done in the past is they've assumed that the way the world is experienced by them is the same way for other people as well. And so they generalize from their own experiences to people across cultures, across genders. And as we know, that's not really the best way to figure out what people think or feel or how they experience things. And so we can ask these questions. Do chimpanzees plan for the future? When they remember things, do they replay them in their head the way we can visually replay walking around through our house? Let's think of an example of a mother dolphin who has a young calf. The infant needs all kinds of care and attention. The mothers sometimes get tired. What has been observed in many different dolphin communities is that other females will come over and kind of babysit. They'll take the dolphin infant away from the mother, or they will come near the mother when the mother's with the infant, as she always is, and then the mother will sink down to the really deep part of the sea where the infant can't go. And sometimes she just stays there and just rests. And the other females are there to take care of the infant. So the mother knows her infant's fine and she can just get a little bit of a break. That's the sort of thing that we can look at and say, this looks like it's a kind of case of empathy. They're doing it because they know she needs a break. What's really funny about humans and human scientists and philosophers is that we seem to think that the animals of interest are the animals that are the farthest away from where we live. And so there's been this tradition in the West of traveling to Africa to study chimpanzees or to Indonesia to study orangutans. And when I've been to Indonesia to study orangutans, the people I talk to, the Indonesian people I talk to say, why would you study the orangutans? I want to study the moose in Canada. I'm interested in squirrels. You have squirrels. Squirrels are so cool. Raccoons, I've heard all about raccoons. They're so interesting. And so we don't have to travel anywhere. We have animals all around us. Another thing that I think is very common for humans is to ask questions about animal minds when the animals are very big and exciting, the elephants and the dolphins and the chimpanzees and then corvids, ravens, the smart animals, so-called smart animals. Why do they have these reputations? It's very strange. We've studied them, and so we found out they're smart. And there are all these animals we haven't studied. And so I was really interested in, for example, studying rats. Why am I going to Indonesia when I could study these rats in my backyard? And so we got some rats and investigated whether rats have culture. Turning to the question of culture in rats and cognition and sociality in rats made me really open my mind to thinking about culture and sociality and cognition in lots of different species where we don't normally think of them. So you might think that animals are just, biologically destined to do the things they do. That birds just build nests innately, and that bees just go out and fly around innately, and they don't have to learn anything. And that learning is something special that we do, and chimpanzees and dolphins and elephants do. But actually, bees learn. They learn from each other. Ants learn. Fruit flies learn. If you give fruit flies, females, a display of other fruit flies, some with a little pink dot on them, some with a little blue dot on them, and they see other females mating with a pink guy, then they all want to have sex with pink guys and not the blue guys. So they learned that. They weren't born thinking pink painted fruit flies are hot. This kind of learning is widespread in the animal kingdom. Birds learn how to build nests. Lots of animals learn how to communicate. Meerkats will actively teach young meerkats how to eat scorpions. So you might think eating a scorpion is dangerous. You would be right about that. It's really hard for meerkats to learn how to eat a scorpion. And so they have teachers who deconstruct the task for them. The first time a young meerkat gets a scorpion to eat, they get a scorpion with the stinger off of it. So it's been already killed, the dangerous part's gone, and the juveniles can interact with it. As the juveniles get better, the teachers give them more and more complex parts of the scorpion to process. And with this kind of scaffolding, they then learn how to kill and eat scorpions on their own. And then they can teach it to the next generation of young meerkats. A scout bee will go and find a place where there's nectar or a new place to build a new hive, and they'll dance for this location. And they dance for an audience, so it's a social event. It's a communicative event. One thing that the audience can do is say, no, that's not a good place. I found a better place. So there's this signal called a stop signal that another bee can get up onto the stage, basically. They give a stop signal and kick the dancer off the stage, and then they start dancing for the other place. Grouper fish are big. They can't get into small crevices. Eels are small. They can get into crevices. A grouper can point to a place. Hey, there's a fish down here, and then the eel goes down and gets it, and then they share the food. There's a lot of collaboration, a lot of interaction on the reef, in the savanna, in the forests, in the natural world. Intelligence is everywhere in the animal kingdom. What if we start studying consciousness in the worms? Because these systems don't have the kind of convoluted details and big brains that we have, we might be able to make a lot more progress in uncovering the mysteries of consciousness when we look for them in the small places, in the hidden places, hidden right in front of our faces in our backyards. We live in a multicultural society with other species and not just with other humans. We have to negotiate because there are differences. I mean, there are all these cases of wild animals who sometimes run afoul of humans in a variety of ways. Sometimes it results in human death, sometimes it results in animal death. It can be a real problem. And so how do we manage this? Lots of attempts to manage human-wildlife interaction between farmers and elephants in Thailand have involved methods like setting off firecrackers at the edges of the farms or making bee fences to try to use bees to keep the elephants away. And none of this is working very well. The elephants still just are more secretive when they come, and they learn from other elephants, it seems, about how to better sneak up into the farms to raid the gardens. The question is there another way? Instead of using brute force to keep the animals out, is there a way to negotiate with them that it would be better for them and for us, and we could be happier together if they would stay out of this area and maybe go to another area that was really beneficial? We interestingly know that wild animals are following these traditions that they've learned for over generations. The border between Germany and Czech, there used to be fences from the Cold War, right, walls. The deer, to this day, appear to obey the wall barrier, even though there's no wall there. The only reason for this is that they've learned it from elders, generation after generation, that we don't go past this line. When we're doing conservation projects and trying to get animals to move in new places, sometimes gates are created, gaps in fences are created to try to allow animals passage, or green corridors are built to get fragmented populations of wild animals to be able to interact with each other and procreate. But we have to also be able to encourage animals to use these green corridors. So how do we do that? They haven't gone this way. We've never gone over here before. We've never gone through this doorway. How do we encourage them to go through this doorway? One way to do that is to really talk to one of the high-ranking individuals in the community. What I mean is show that individual that this is a really beneficial place to go, that there are goodies here. So reinforce that behavior on an individual basis so that the animal trusts us and then comes to trust that area. Now, if a high-ranking animal trusts that area, then other animals who copy that behavior will then also use this highway crossing or this green corridor or this fence gap. And so this is a way of negotiating and changing norms in an animal society for the benefit of the animals and for the humans. So I have a book that I think is a super fun book called The Animal Mind. It's an introduction to the philosophy of animal cognition. So if you're interested in questions about animal consciousness and about animal rationality, I discuss social cognition and how good other species are at understanding the minds of one another. I also really investigate the question about whether animals could be moral actors, whether they have their own moral codes that they follow, and look at this from the perspective of philosophy and philosophical theories of ethics. One of the things I think is really important about thinking about animal culture and animal social norms has to do with animal welfare for captive animals. So a lot of the animals that we kind of know best are captive animals. So the pets that live in our houses, animals that we might see in the zoos or who are in laboratories. Sometimes what looks like a harmful behavior or behavior that animals doing that we should stop might not be a behavior that we should stop in that population because that behavior might be significant to the animal culturally. And one of the reasons why the keepers and caregivers allow chimpanzees to play with feces and sometimes even eat feces is that the thought is that this might be a culturally important behavior for some communities of chimpanzees. Are there harms in eating feces? Well, sure, like there are pathogens. It's not something that we'd recommend, but there are also harms to lots of important cultural behaviors that humans engage in, right? When we pierce our body or tattoo our skin, we're also risking infection. Is it going to kill us? No. Is eating poop going to kill the chimpanzees? No. We have to be really careful that we're not kind of enforcing our own cultural norms onto other animal species or animal groups just because it makes us uncomfortable or it seems gross or somehow problematic to us. This is where it's important for us to develop empathy with the other animals and try to see from their perspective why this behavior might be important. You might think like, what can I do to help other animals because I don't work at a zoo or work in a lab? But if you've got a dog at home or some other sort of a pet, you can do the same sort of empathic practice with your own animal that I've been talking about. For example, when I walk my dog, the walks are very, very slow or very, very fast, depending on what my dog Riddle wants to do. Sometimes he just wants to sniff everywhere and pee on every little piece of grass he can find. And I let him do that. Not because I see value in peeing on the grass and sniffing everybody else's pee, but because it's important to him. And it's really important for dogs when they want to know what's going on in the neighborhood that they have this opportunity to sniff and smell. Imagine every time you went to answer a text, someone stole your phone. That's kind of what happens when you're walking a dog and you don't let them sniff. Humans don't seem to recognize that we could be interacting with other species as much as we do. And this kind of learning about how animals survive in what is a multi-species and multicultural environment, I think might help us understand better how we can thrive in our own multicultural environments when we're just dealing with human cultures, but also our multicultural, multi-species environment.
Tomorrow on the agenda.
When you're out on the trail, you don't make a lot of noise. People don't have to know that you're coming along the trail. And you know, the quieter you are and the more observant you are, the chances for viewing animals and birds and insects is much, much, much greater.
That's tomorrow on the agenda. The agenda is always on. To catch up on conversations from this week or any week, visit our website, tvo.org/theagenda, or our YouTube page at youtube.com/theagenda. It's all there for whenever you want to watch.